Hello to our colleagues joining us from all over the world. On behalf of the IFAPP Academy, I'm Pravin Chopra, and as chair of the Academy's Scientific Advisory Committee, it's my privilege to welcome all of you to yet another episode of Conversations with the Academy. This is an initiative under the umbrella of the Academy's value-added programs. Now, these offerings aspire to elevate the professional ethos, strengthen the sense of community, and address our academic needs for our members, while also exploring trending issues affecting or involving the evolving healthcare scenario. With the burgeoning global challenges across, when we look at the need for approvals, and we also see how the new market approved treatments, the clinical evidence today is increasingly insufficient to fully guide physicians and policymakers in choosing the optimal treatment for their patients. Increasingly, real-world evidence, or the evidence derived from the analysis and or synthesis of real-world data, is stepping in to fill that gap by providing documentation on the relative effectiveness of a treatment strategy in routine clinical practice, already in early phase of development, while still trying to maintain the strength and the rigor of randomized clinical trials. The evolving COVID scenario offers yet another opportunity to lead the communications around evidence generation and the real-world evidence and real-world data. This evaluation methodology, the traditional versus pragmatic trials, the regulatory oversight, the ethics, and the patient access to innovative therapies is often going to be the center of focus. And to explore these perspectives in this emerging scenario, we are indeed dignified with the preeminent faculty sharing their insights and expertise with us. I must confess right at the outset that Dr. Alvaro Quintana, who was scheduled to be moderating and helping us drive through this and has been driving the concept behind this, is unable to join us for a last-minute unavoidable conflict, and we truly regret and miss his presence here. But it behooves that I still introduce him on this platform because of the background that he brought in. Alvaro, and some of you have probably worked with him, brings a comprehensive background through academia, clinical medicine, and drug development, having trained both as a physician in Uruguay and with a master's in medical microbiology from the prestigious London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and with advanced degrees as well. And today, his research is still focused on antibiotic resistance and infection control, while practicing, and he has been, through his background with practice at Montevideo's leading hospital, he is in a very critical position to be able to drive Pfizer's antimicrobial portfolio and the anti-infectives portfolio, especially with the emerging markets. So right off the bat, we acknowledge Alvaro's and the contribution here. We will also move in to introduce our distinguished panel here. And we move on to David. David has been part of the faculty and the academy for a long time now, and he brings a background, a strong academic background in mathematics and applied statistics from Oxford University. But with a distinguished career over the years, today he is in a position to be able to advise the industry as a statistical consultant, and also at the same time contribute to the academic world as a visiting senior lecturer within the Pharmaceutical Medicine group at King's College London. David is also very active in the statistician in the industry, and it's known as PSI. And while not only has he served as many leading positions in the industry statistician group, but he also contributes to maintaining the academic excellence through writing and as editor-in-chief in some of the journals. So thank you for being with us, David. And then we have Penny. Penny brings a broad perspective, not only from the background of her training as in medicine from the University College, but she also has spent time in practice with a background in ops and gynae, as we would fondly call it. But then she transitioned so that she could make a bigger difference in the global platform to the pharmaceutical industry. And having gone through several large organizations which have received the benefit of her partnership, today she is at the front of being able to obtain or at least guide the process of the process of licensure, which is critical today, as you've seen the fast-moving guidelines changing. And she also chairs the Education and Standards Committee at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, along with being a visiting professor at the institution. So you do see that all of them have maintained the balance between academic, clinical medicine, and today are making an important contribution to the evolving pharmaceutical medicine group there. Welcome, Penny, and thank you so much for being part of the panel here today.
Thank you.
So it behooves me to set the groundwork today. We're going to have, while we will offer presentation, and I'll try to take the group through with some of the basic concepts, basically to set the tone on what we are. The ambition today is not to be able to write a didactic session on real-world evidence, but just to give the glossary and take people through the basic tenets, and then bring in the perspectives of how the landscape has changed. There will be opportunity for our audience to be able to ask questions. So if you go on the panel on the right, unfortunately, we can't open it up to everyone to speak, but we will certainly allow them to be able to type the questions in, and the panelists can see it here. And moreover, we did receive, very interestingly, some questions in advance, which Penny, you and David have also had occasion to see. And so if you could bring it into your question, I will take the liberty of interjecting and asking you at the same time. And finally, there will be some poll questions just to throw in and break the inertia, but also to gauge the mood of the audience. And you will see some poll questions coming up as we go through. So Jacob, we appreciate you and your operations team to take us through some of the slides. Can I ask you to move it on to the next one, please? And we keep going. So I think the whole question here, we find ourselves in a position where the world is changing from being focused on defining efficacy in the traditional sense of the trials and moving the gear to effectiveness. And the more question we find that when we are making the optimal treatment or choosing treatment for our patients in our various fields, the challenge clearly is that how does this make sense when we translate that into the real world or the practicing world? How do we make sense with the various dimensions that are the interplays that come in later on? And today, is it possible to mend the two or mesh the two and make sure that today we are able to ask some of the questions that we generate much after? And in the past, when usually these used to come in a traditional phase 4 post-approval sense, increasingly the need for epidemiology and the real-world medicine data or the real-world data is being fast-tracked up in the early phases of development at the same time. Next slide, Jacob. So what we want to achieve today is to just seed the thought with our audience and probably get feedback from you as to where we see the gaps and where we see some of the challenges in trying to do this bridge from the early development onto what we see is in the setting where we are in our real lives, with all the variables that come in, whether it's patient liking, compliance, treatment patterns, and how is it that today the regulators are perceiving it. That's where Penny would come in at the same time. We will also try to see what is the value between the two designs and some of the pros and cons, which David will help us assess. And we will also try to leave it open, opening this door up to subsequent webinars that we will have in the future. So you are invited to join in those as well. Next slide. So as we would see today, to set the agenda, we will just try to go through some of the pen, and for the life of me, I don't look like Alvaro. He's much more in a position to do it. But those of you who know it, I will try to step in and make sure that I do justice to what he has created. And I left it here because he has helped divide the tenets of the principles here. A little bit of historical perspective also, Alvaro and I were trying to bring in, because we've all heard of the earlier, this has been there for a long time through Framingham, etc. But today it's reached a level of a science and a need and a regulation. Let's go to the next slide. So let's take a break here and throw a poll to the audience. Jacob, can we just see how this is evolving? And we would like the audience to be able to just put their thoughts and see what do they believe is the standard. Do we see real world evidence as just the basis of whatever we can do in a retrospective action, pragmatic trials, and the data. So the question's up here, and we can open it up to the audience to be able to run. And I believe that you'll be able to press your choice in a second, right, Jacob? There you go. So let's throw the question back again, and so that we can see what the answers were to the questions.
Sure.
So we all have decided that, and if you just go back one slide, so an overwhelming majority, David and Penny, are bringing that real-world data is relating to the patient health status and the delivery healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And David, in your premise, and Penny, in your experience here, is this what we are seeing as becoming increasingly prominent, or there are still areas of opportunity to improve here?
I think I would say to that, yes and yes. I mean, this is what we're seeing, but there are really, as technology develops and as the sources of data develop, there are many other ways in which we can look at data, and will do so.
Mm-hmm. So there has been an increasing shift away from paper-based case note recording towards electronic means of reporting and collecting information on patients, which are held within electronic healthcare records. And some places have produced standardized healthcare records, particularly in the United States, where particular disease entities have particular requirements, and hospitals have, mostly it has to be said, for the avoidance of lawsuits, produce standardized case records which require doctors to complete information on the ways in which patients have been treated and managed. So that information is not so far from the sort of information we would collect on case record forms when we're doing an industry-sponsored trial. So in fact, if you want to conduct a study in the real world, then using these standardized healthcare records as your means for collecting that information is a starter. And I'll be discussing that at more length later.
Excellent. And you know, it also lends itself for us as those who've been doing trials all across the electronic health records, which are being more and more in use, even in all the emerging markets as well, is really allowing the opportunity to compare data across the board, and also making it more ubiquitous, if you could call it that way as well. So that is something that's, and the more we are able to deal with, that's going to be an important step forward. Can we move on then? I think this has really set the tone on what people are realizing, that there are many dimensions, not only data collection, but data analysis, and also the ability to do cross purposes. So really what's happening is, we are on the ability to now look at some of the information, what we are talking about here. And if you look at the three areas of safety, effectiveness, and resource use, etc., we find that the umbrella term that we are using for the real world data allows us to broaden what we are collecting in the highly controlled environment of the randomized clinical trials, which have obviously served a purpose. But beyond that, when we're looking at resource use, the intervariability, the safety issues, and in the larger population with various comorbidities, this is really an opportunity to put some meaning around what we are collecting. And as Penny alluded to in the last in the question, and that the audience has even picked up very well, the ubiquitous availability of electronic health record systems and the ability to link routine healthcare systems directly might facilitate really real-world evidence research. And David, dare I say that the pragmatic trials may also see an opportunity to be able to have some more emphasis around reality, which really moves the shift, as I was saying, from efficacy to effectiveness. The traditional phase 3 randomized clinical trials, and even the post-launch observational studies, the observational studies, as we know, tried to mimic as best as we could without interference into what is a normal practice, and that would allow and this is also deterred by what is usual care or standard of care in the settings that we all work in, and that could be different. And as we all know, in emerging markets, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and of course Western Europe and others have very different usual care and standard of care. So the ability to cross-examine or cross-assess, it becomes even more difficult. So, and as we see it then, the traditional trials or even the what would have been a very well-designed observational study would still have limitations in providing what we would call the relative effectiveness of treatment options or real-world analyses around it. And really the limitations are first because these trials are usually conducted in selected populations in a highly controlled setting and optimized to show the effect of the drug. And the second, because bias, especially prognostic in the incompatibility between patient groups in observational research, it cannot be ruled out. And both the patient selection process and the bias need to be accounted for. And as David would take you through, that even the pragmatic trials now offer the opportunity to be able to bring the same sense of rigor that we have seen in traditional trials and bring this in. So the term pragmatic does not imply that there's a lowering of the standards, really, but it's in fact adding a dimension which, when attributed or when applied with the same challenge, will be able to give us an even more meaningful and more pertinent result. And David will also take us through with some of the modeling there. Next slide, Jacob. And this has been picked up from one of the series of write-ups on the trial design, and I would urge you to look at this at your spare time later on to pick up this. This entire series of references are really wonderful. And what we see here, and while David will certainly discuss the design choices going forward, the definition of the treatment, the assessment of the results, and the choice of the subjects all will determine the generalizability of the study results. So we will move, and if we want to be able to make prognostic even more, let's say, official policy setting decisions, it's important to be able to project that, and the limitations of the three parameters that I'm mentioning here, the definitional, assessment of results, and the choice of subjects, does put limitations. And how do we open this up? And we move to the other side where we see how there are effects, and we just club it under extraneous effects. But you look at all of these, whether it's a physician's expectations or the placebo effect from the patient's point of view, or the other medications they're taking, or they just go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy may be saying, look, can I substitute with this or generic? And I don't have this. And so those are also influencing compliance. And dare I say that if we are able to do this, if we are able to control these for these variables, then this approach maximizes the possibility to reveal a treatment effect. It may also limit the generalizability of the results to the patient population, if you look on the left side of the screen, and that would be preempted if the patient is receiving treatment in routine clinical practice. Once market authorization has been granted, the variables will change, and how do we make sure that we are able to build these or control for these as we go forward? And that's the challenge the design faces. Thank you. So again, not to bore you with some of the definitions here, but the idea is that there's a complex interplay between the pragmatic design options for feasibility, stakeholder acceptability, the validity, the precision, and the generalizability. People, I'm sure the audience is familiar with some of these terms, but it's important to put it all in the context of one. And we felt that one of the ways we get hamstrung is when there are different perspectives here, and this interplay needs to be recognized as one way to go forward. The next, if I could just take you through, it's also to see that this is not something which is esoteric or new. And David and Penny Pinchin, and you will see this when you see through the years that it's been there staring at us. It has been there over the years, and pragmatic trials, they also may also provide us an opportunity to generate evidence in an earlier stage than in the current development paradigm, where real-world evidence generally is only collected post-launch. And we've seen that in the past, where over the years, whether it was the discovery of the beta blockers or the treatment of diabetes, or even the relationship between scurvy and citrus, these have been there over the years, but to be able to put perspective of documentation and the adaptation of some of the dial designs that came in the late 40s gave us a sense of ability to guide and bring in what could be the way to be able to extrapolate this into larger population. But the randomization and blinding and the standards that were determined that time obviously set in some limitations, critical for efficacy, critical to define earlier approvals, but certainly making us hamstrung when we go to the larger population. And the Framingham was a classic example, as we all have been familiar with and grown up. It launched years ago, initially a small goal about what could be factors in the life to be able to contribute to see cardiovascular disease, but later on became a successful analysis through a series of generations and still continues to guide some of the factors around it. And the results of pragmatic trials and observational trials are an important component of the evidence needed to inform guidelines, recommendations, and decision-making by healthcare providers, patients, and dare I say, policymakers. And so we've seen that evolve. Next slide, Jacob. And what we are seeing today is, where are we? And when we see ourselves in this position, we've come a long way from making this like a backup option in the medical affairs domain in later part of the approval, but now bringing it right up to the stage where translational medicine is also determining the targets based on populations. And the goal of pragmatic and the observational studies instead is to really understand the real life efficacy as the effectors that we speak to. I would also, and I'll leave the last part here to Penny to bring in the regulatory agencies issues, but if you look at the scenario today and the big question facing us, 2020 has brought us that the COVID-19 crisis has presented an inflection point for the use of real-world evidence in the industry. The pandemic has also triggered an unprecedented race to produce safe and effective therapies and vaccines. And the desire to drastically accelerate research and development, we've discussed that amongst ourselves too, that is this here to stay? And we've talked about rolling reviews, we've talked about approvals, and how do we bring that same pragmatism into the ability to introduce new molecules or innovative molecules earlier on is a challenge we're going to face. And the desire to reduce this time and to accelerate research and development, of course, reinforced with a greater understanding of the data and the science, has made the healthcare community much more receptive to expanding the use of real-world evidence beyond traditional safety-related applications. And so what we see now is there's an appetite which is opening up. And dare I say, this is an opportunity for us. I can see both David and Penny ready to take the role to see how this is going to bring the world on tomorrow. I'll take a break here. Let's take a poll, and while we're going to look at some of the questions coming in, we haven't seen too many questions coming in. Either this has been completely in line with what they're expecting, but let's have a look as where we stand. So just a quick poll of the audience's pulse and whether people are still around. So I must add here that we've got a fairly large audience here from global. We've got over 100, 120 folks, 122 folks on the line here, and that speaks volumes of what we believe is the value that this can bring in. So here's another poll question. There we go. So clearly the response has been that, among others, the quality of data are a key factor that we able to answer those regulatory questions. And I'm assuming that while all of these would have some degree of credibility, and that's why you do see a group talking about, because it is correct that observational studies do not necessarily fulfill all the requirements, but we also know that the requirements are changing. Penny, David, any comments on this?
Thank you. So yes, I think all of us are used to using randomized blinded comparative trials to answer regulatory questions in the pre-approval stage. But observational studies can fulfill regulatory requirements, for example, to address benefit risk concerns with a marketed product, or to identify and answer signal factors for pharmacovigilance activities. Over recent years, we've seen increasingly the use of observational data on outcomes and disease progression to enable an understanding in particular of rare diseases and the construct of what I would call historical controls, or non-randomized control populations from which outcomes with a new treatment in an orphan disease can be compared. And indeed, that has been increasingly utilized also in cancer therapeutic trials in rarer cancers or in very advanced disease, and has resulted in conditional or earlier approvals of investigational products in those areas.
So, Penny, here's another very interesting question that come up, and Paula is asking us, what is the role of patient registries, in your opinion, in order to generate real-world data? And how do you see the regulators' response to registries?
The regulators have used registry information to enable, this question of how a disease is progressing, and what are the outcomes in real-world practice of current availability of, particularly for orphan disease indications. And an example of that, for example, is ipilimumab, which is a treatment for hemophagocytic histiolymphocytosis, which is a rare complication of macrophage activation syndrome. And a disease registry was used to describe disease trajectory in affected children in that particular patient group, and then compared to outcomes with following intervention with the anti-interferon gamma antibody, and resulted, as I say, in approval of that product in the US. So one of the issues, though, is that different regulatory environments are at different stages in their movement to acceptance, and we'll be talking about that later.
Great. There's one, before I move to David, there's one more question. Maybe, Penny, you can field that one as well, which is here, when you're looking at, well, let's switch to David first. When you're looking at physicians, is it for the use of in their information? What are examples of physicians being able to access large real-world databases directly rather than through publishing and analysis? Is there an opportunity for folks to access these databases as they're being collected or ongoing? And what is the limitation there when you're looking at collecting the data?
That might be a bit more of a question for David.
David, yes.
Well, I think the whole question of access to databases is an important one, and clearly, because if you're setting up any sort of electronic system, it costs a lot of money to set it up and very little to add data to it, which means that the holders of those databases, they're wanting to cover their costs in some ways. Now, clearly, a lot of databases are byproducts of other processes, and particularly I'm thinking of the databases held by the big insurance companies in the US. Within the UK, we've got a very good system, what was GPRD, now CPRD, but it's in where that has hit problems was money-wise. It was owned privately at one time. It's now actually being taken care of by the regulatory authority because they see it as so useful. So I think there are lots of questions about access. I think academic access is generally good and well justified, but people will always be looking in some way to cover it. And I think that militates against access to the individual physician for what we might call informal research or doing quick searches.
Yeah, but David, we're also seeing an increasing interest with what we would call, and us in the industry call it, investigator-initiated studies. And this is also an opportunity for the investigator to step in and take the usual approvals from the, from the regulatory authorities locally, and probably make it more relevant for small areas where a large company may not be willing to invest. So how do they segue into a larger database if they don't have the access? What would you encourage, say, folks in a local area? Because that has led to discoveries in the past.
That's a good point, and I guess it would come down to maybe, if there is a funding body who can support it. And I mean, I know I'll talk about a pragmatic study which looked like it was going to be really cheap, being done as part of the National Health Service in the UK, until the academic and health service realized it was being used as a pass study for a pharmaceutical company. And so the costs went up not unreasonably. The people treating patients felt that they would want to be, something they would have done free or as part of their normal role for a public sector investigation, wanted to be paid something when the private sector was involved. So I think if we are looking for benefit for our products through local, through investigator initiatives, there are probably still prices to be paid for that.
Excellent. And Penny, I was alluding a question to you, which is a very interesting one is coming, but I hold it till after this is done. This is from Robert about evidence generation and the acceptability in the physician committee. So let's move on. I think this has opened up so many questions. David, I'll request you to take us away with the presentation, with your thoughts around how do we legitimize or increase the value of pragmatic trials. All yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is actually contribute some real world evidence, because while we've been on here, I'm part of a COVID-19 study out of King's College, along with 4.5 million other people, where I report my health every day. It tells me I last reported yesterday. I tell them I've never had a COVID test. I haven't had a vaccine, despite what my granddaughter thinks I'm not that old. And I feel physically normal. Thank you for reporting. So that's the COVID Zoe app. So there is some real world data. Now that gives us an immediate thing of saying, okay, if I didn't report today, and this is one of the questions we have about validity or bias, it's very often a question of looking at what's not there. We get very excited by large data sets. Oh, this is great, we can analyze it to death. What's not there? And if I didn't report, does that mean maybe I'm not reporting because I'm so ill with COVID that I can't report? Maybe I'm just distracted doing some other activity, as I am. Or maybe I'm feeling so good that I'm out doing a 10-mile run. So, not reporting could introduce some sort of bias in different directions. And one of the clues we have in looking at all our data is we need to ask what's not there. So what we're looking at in general is about, are we going to observe or experiment, and how valid are those approaches? And in a way, what I'm doing here, the bottom half of this slide, is just looking at validity, or validity being the absence of bias, in two directions, dividing it into two things. One, internal validity of a study is the degree of confidence that the causal relationship we are testing is not influenced by other factors or variables. The external validity is the extent to which our results can be generalized to other contexts. And ideally, we want both. But in fact, it's the play of those two is what we're going to be looking at. Can we have the next slide, please? So it's really a reminder of why are randomized clinical trials seen as the gold standard. What randomization gives us is, because treatment allocation is done by chance, it ensures that the treatment groups, within the limits of probability, but with large studies it works very well, the treatment groups will be similar in every respect other than the investigative treatment applied. And this applies for factors which are known to be important, and sometimes we might stratify the randomization to improve precision even further. But it's also true for factors whose impact is unknown, or which we don't know anything about at the time. And even whether we measure them or not, it's still true. We also ensure internal validity by blinding, so that the assessment of the outcome is not affected by knowledge of the patient's assigned treatment by either the patient or the investigator or the operational staff. And this enables us to avoid bias and gives a randomized clinical trial high internal validity. But then this is a quote pretty much. When I came into the pharmaceutical industry and I told my general practitioner that I was doing this and working on clinical trials that he would be very grateful to read, he said to me, well, that's fine, he said, but your industry trials, they all seem to be on patients from 18 to 65, generally healthy apart from the one disease you're investigating. They're taking no other drugs, whereas the patients I see are mostly over 65, suffering from several diseases and taking multiple drugs. How can I be sure that your trial results are applicable to my patients? Or putting it another way, does your drug work in the real world? And that's what we mean by external validity. Next slide. An example, the Nurses' Health Study started in 1976. It was known that after menopause, the rate of heart disease in women rises. So the question was, is it worth giving estrogen and progesterone after the menopause to lower the rate of heart disease? They entered 127,000 nurses aged between 30 and 55, and they completed a questionnaire every 2 years. Got a fantastic response. 90% of questionnaires returned. I think probably never achieved since for that type of study. And that resulted 20 years later in a paper showing that the estrogen users had 40% fewer heart attacks than those taking no hormones. And a subsequent result showed similarly with progesterone as well. Millions of prescriptions followed. The problem is that, of course, because people aren't randomized to treatment, some are taking hormones, some are not. The groups will differ to some degree. And what it was found was the women who were taking hormones were less likely to have a family history of heart disease, less likely to have hypertension or diabetes, less likely to smoke. They were more likely to take aspirin, birth control pills, vitamins. They were younger, they drank more alcohol, and they were eating more saturated fat. And if you think about those, all apart from saturated fat and possibly alcohol are positive risks. Well, sorry, are going to mean they're positive things for cardiovascular safety. And on top of that, they were wealthier. And one interesting thing about almost all epidemiological studies, however many things you adjust for, you always find that wealth or income still has an effect beyond that. So the groups differed in different ways. These are what we call confounding variables. Next slide. So it could be that one of the differences in the confounding variables caused the difference. Maybe the fact they were taking more aspirin had a protective effect rather than the hormone treatment. So in general, we've got maybe there's some factor X which makes use of the hormone treatment more likely, and factor X also makes heart attacks less likely. We can make some sort of statistical adjustments through regression or more sophisticated things like propensity analysis, but only, of course, for things that we have measured. If there's factors we've not measured, things that we've not thought of, maybe things that scientifically didn't exist when our study started, then we could be in trouble with those. Well, in this case, there was a study done that was a randomized trial, and there's an interesting story behind it. When the NIH, it was pointed out to them that they weren't doing anything to investigate women's diseases, that they set up a massive randomized trial to investigate the same sort of question. Not exactly the same coverage, not exactly the same patients, the women were older in this case. Also, doses of estrogen had changed somewhat. But in the randomized trial, the study was stopped 3 years early because of, among other things, higher rates of heart disease among the patients, and at an important level. Heart disease, 8 more events per 10,000 women in the hormone group. So not only had what was a very well-designed and large observational study, not only had it missed those effects, it had actually got them the other way around. Again, to take an example from the King's College study that I've just entered some data to, first paragraph there, well, the study found a small correlation between dietary supplements and reduced COVID-19 risk. But they make the point, this doesn't confirm that supplements are actually responsible. People who take vitamins and other supplements may also be more likely to take better care of their overall health and engage in steps to avoid the virus, like wearing masks and frequent hand washing. This so-called healthy bias could explain why people who took supplements were less likely to catch the virus. So you've always got that sort of problem. Next slide. So we've got the internal validity of the randomized trial and the external validity of the real world, where we're in a much broader population of people taking multiple drugs, people with multiple diseases. Do they actually take the drugs that are prescribed? Is there a compromise? Is there a way in which we can get the best of both worlds? Well, pragmatic trials offer all sorts of possibilities. And in situations where we have genuine uncertainty about what the best treatment is, then we can allow medical practitioners to randomize patients to treatments, then follow them up as normal in the real world. The randomization will ensure that treatment groups are comparable. And sometimes it may be that we want to randomize practices to treatment. So then the doctor doesn't have to think, hang on, what am I doing here? They treat all their patients the same. Another practice will do things differently. And for example, we have continuous ongoing pragmatic trials in the UK on influenza vaccine, where different practices will invite people for the vaccine using different wordings in the letters that you get or the emails that you get, and then investigate what effect that has on it. They also do the same with our tax returns, actually. So you've got a combination of a sort of pragmatic trial and the nudge process. And when you're randomizing practices rather than individual patients, then that's what we call cluster randomization. So one example of a pragmatic trial is what we call a probe trial, where it's prospective, it's randomized, but then it's open, it's not blinded. Both the patient and the investigator will be clear, so the treatment goes on as normal. The operational study team might be blinded to avoid any bias from them. And then you would have a blinded endpoint, which could be assessed by an individual not connected to the study. And a quick example being the so-called FAST study, next slide, which I was involved in setting up some years ago. And again, it was a large study investigating, it was a post-approval safety study done in this way, where the goal was to do everything as close to real world as we could. Next slide. And just to give a very quick overview of it, it recruited patients over 60 who were prescribed allopurinol, had at least one additional cardiovascular risk factor, so carefully defined population really to make sure we got a decent number of events. They were then randomized to be titrated to optimal dose of allopurinol, the existing drug, of febuxostat, then new, and then followed up for at least 2 years through electronic records. Scotland was available in that way, and Denmark. Interestingly, the EMA insisted on an annual face-to-face assessment, even though that wasn't within the label or anything of that sort. So it was a big trial, recruited 6,000 patients. It's actually just reported in the autumn that there was no excess deaths on febuxostat, unlike the US trial, which did find a small excess of overall deaths.
Penny, all yours.
Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? So David has talked to us about the use of electronic healthcare data sets to follow patients randomized to different therapies to address a regulatory question in a post-marketing circumstance. There has been a considerable experience amongst regulatory authorities in the use of real-world data to address concerns for safety information and indeed to address questions about relative efficacy for different types of medicine in certain conditions. In addition, as we mentioned earlier, regulators have got increasingly used to the idea of constructing control data sets from either registry or other healthcare database information to enable investigation of the impact of therapies in orphan disease indications. And the FDA, I think, and also the Medicines Health Regulatory Agency have recently brought forward new guidances which draw the attention of the pharmaceutical community to things to consider, if you like, in looking at the use of data, excuse me, and how to turn that real world information into evidence for regulatory decision making. So I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the Medicines Health Regulatory Agency's draft guidance on randomized controlled trials generating real-world evidence to support regulatory decisions, which was published on the MHRA website for comment from the industry in October 2020. And as David has pointed out already, from a regulatory perspective, the agency points out whether or not the trial is classified as generating real-world data is not so critical. The important thing is that the trial that you're conducting is designed in such a way that it allows the trial to provide evidence required to answer the question concerned. And this does include consideration regarding the endpoints required, the requirement for blinding, and any of the other decisions made when designing, conducting, and analysing a critical clinical trial, which are dependent on the trial that on the questions the trial is seeking to answer, rather than on the source of the data obtained to answer that question. So there is, in fact, no requirement on behalf of the health regulatory agency, if you like, to collect information specifically to address an answer within a trial, but rather encouragement to consider use of the healthcare record database as a mechanism to sample more broadly from the patient population and to construct trials within utilizing that information to then support regulatory decision making. Now, of course, what this then emphasizes is the importance of the quality of the data that you're going to be using in order to be able to make that information available, and also for it to be of sufficient quality. So there is a great emphasis, particularly in the MHRA draft guidance, but also in the FDA's draft guidance, on the use of real-world evidence for decision-making, on the quality of the information and on the control of information. As you extract the data from the database into the analysis platform that you're going to use to analyze the results of the study. And as for all trials, the data quality and the assurance and appropriate data management oversight of that process is essential. The MHRA have suggested that these data quality processes should be detailed in the trial protocol, and also the methodologies validated to ensure that those processes applied are fit for the intended use, and that there should be regular data quality assurance checks in order to audit the data values and to ensure that these comply with good clinical practice. And this would require the setting of specifications for the information set and requirements that the data received or extracted from the totality of the electronic case record forms only contains the expected data files constructed in order to enable appropriate analysis. And we're used to this in the context of case record form collected information and the use of the CDISC requirements to classify information and control it, and actually real-world data extracted from an electronic healthcare record on an individual person within a general practice data or a hospital activity form is no different. And indeed, that was the process used for collecting information in the recovery trial, which was recently used to allow licensure of dexamethasone for the management of hospitalized patients with COVID. Next slide, please. So what this means is that we then need to really think carefully about the quality of the data sets that are going to be utilized within that kind of working environment. And this slide here is taken from a publication in 2018 and is actually a publication written by the EMA, who were interested in the use of real-world information as an active tool to pharmacovigilance planning and tracking. And indeed, as we're intending to use this information for COVID vaccine safety and real-world efficacy information going forward, it's important to understand where different countries are in terms of the construct of their electronic healthcare records, both in terms of the data generated readiness for being utilized in a real-world kind of way, and also in the technical underpinning of that data set in order to be able to facilitate extraction for use for analysis. So what one can derive from all of this information really is that rather than having clinical research associates going and looking at paper records held within a hospital and comparing, or clinical trial center, and comparing that to information that is held within the company's clinical trial data set as collected on case report forms, in the future, we're going to be able to really track the generation and timing of entry of data into an electronic healthcare record, and then to be able to monitor that, the movement of that healthcare record and any amendments made to it into the analytical framework that we will use to construct information sets to be sent to the regulator for analysis if you're in the US, or to construct the data outcome information that is contained within the final study reports and integrated summaries as part of a regulatory submission ex-US. And if you like, the data management is going to become the new CRA. I think that's what I wanted to say, and I'm happy to take questions and discussion now.
Excellent, Penny. You really brought it all together with some of the things, and I can see the questions are burgeoning here online, which we will take. I must inform the audience as well that this is being recorded, and hopefully, Jacob, I hope I'm correct, that we are going to be making this available. So while the slides may not be there, you will still have access to be able to see some of the responses and the challenges. I'm going to hold the poll question because it's more important that some of these real-time ones being asked. Penny, here's one for you, and again, David, I'll throw one at you again right after this. And this is an interesting one, where the regulatory authorities are more and more inclined to accept real-world evidence data. And I know we are coming close to time here. The medical community and the physicians seem to be more reluctant to do so. What do you feel could be the reasons, and how could we improve this uptake from them?
I think clinicians wonder about the quality of the medical record database that is being utilised, and they might not be so familiar with the idea of a constructed data set from regularly collected records. Also, differences in medical practice between countries mean that different information may be available in electronic healthcare records from different countries, and if a particular country has a particular way of treating disease X that differs from a different the protocol in a different country, then they may feel that that information is not so relevant to their clinical practice. But I honestly think that as we go forward with people utilising standardised electronic healthcare records going forward, particularly those that are merged with additional specifically collected pieces of information, that by demonstrating how we do this, we can increase confidence in the reliability of that information.
Excellent. Farhana, I hope that answers your question. And Matthias has also raised another question. This is for you, David. It's very interesting. You know, we are all seeing the safe harbors and the GDPR requirements coming in. In your mind, despite this interpretation of data privacy regulations is interpreted differently in different EU countries. And so what do you believe, and this could be extrapolated to other markets as well, what are the limiting, what do you believe is the limitation of collecting this across countries? And I know that while electronic health data records are there, Penny has already viewed it. When you are analyzing this, what do you feel, how can we help overcome this challenge about privacy, safe harbors, data sharing, and different standards?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that, really. What is difficult in a way is because particularly the US and Europe are sort of coming at it in a different perspective. But I think in a way, if necessary, you can combine data on, by region or something of that sort, before then combining the whole thing globally. So I'm sure it is possible to overcome the concerns. I mean, I remember there was a paper about 5 or 6 years ago pointing out if you pick up a hair in the street in Chicago, there's an astonishingly high percentage you could guess the surname of the person it came from. I think that the real concerns have gone, but it is a particular issue in rare diseases, and that is one thing we do have to watch for. Except that very often the patient groups have given so much information away on Facebook that it's sort of, well, I went for my checkup today, and then if you know where they are, you could probably pick them up out of the registry.
Excellent. Now, I could just go on and on. In fact, the other question which has come up here is attractive for both of you, I'm sure, and Nishta from India is asking, what is the role of artificial intelligence in collecting real-world evidence data? And that throws up a whole new caveat of things. So I know that we are struck for time here and people need to drop off here. It leaves me to thank both of you profusely. Penny, a wonderful time. I know you had to step in, and both you and David had to step in late, but this has opened up a huge window of opportunity for us to be able to discuss. And as you see, I'm going to also invite our audience, and they've been very, very appreciative also, which I can see, but also thank them because they've been from all over the world. And I know that people in Asia, in Shanghai and India and Australia are really late, but they have stayed on. So many, many thanks. But it also is a little teaser for what's to come. And I want to lay the thoughts that next month, we are going to continue the debate and what is more topical than the COVID vaccinology right now, and what we are doing today steps up to the basic principle of new development. So I'm going to stop here, invite everyone for our next session on February 26th. Thank you for all of you for being here. Penny, David, profuse thanks for putting it all together. And in absentia, I'm also thanking Alvaro for having brought us together today. And hopefully this leads to doors open to much more. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the operations team for putting this together. And till the next time, have a lovely day, have a safe evening, and all of you be safe and lots of joy. Thank you.